Hello, I'm Talia Martinez, GSP, Safety Consultant with the Kentucky Education Labor Cabinet. This module covers the requirements associated with emergency action plans. In this module, we'll dive into all things emergency action plans. We will discuss who the standard applies to, as well as exceptions to some requirements. We're going to discuss the difference in oral and written emergency action plans and details regarding sheltering in place, what it is, ideal shelters, and when a shelter in place would be necessary. We will cover the minimum requirements as set forth by 1910.38 and evacuation requirements specifically. We will also discuss ideas that could be beneficial to some facilities. Finally, we will discuss reviewing requirements, both when you should review with employees and when the plan should be reviewed for accuracy. So, what is an emergency action plan? An emergency action plan is basically a plan of action that addresses reasonably anticipated hazards, such as a fire, severe weather, or even an active shooter. Who's required to have an emergency action plan? Well, almost every business is required to have an emergency action plan, or an EAP. If fire extinguishers are required or provided in your workplace, and if anyone will be evacuating during a fire or other emergency, then OSHA's 1910.157, the standard for portable fire extinguishers, requires you to have an emergency action plan. The only exemption to this is if you have an in-house fire brigade in which every employee is trained and equipped to fight fires, and consequently, no one evacuates. In most circumstances, immediate evacuation is the best policy, especially if professional firefighting services are available to respond quickly. There may be situations where employee firefighting is warranted to give other workers time to escape or to prevent danger to others by spread of a fire. In this case, you as the employer are still required to have an emergency action plan. Per OSHA's 1910.160C1, if a workplace is protected by a total flooding system, which provides agent concentrations exceeding the maximum safe levels set forth in paragraphs B5 and B6 of 1910.162, then the facility is required to have an emergency action plan. Even if your facility is exempt from the requirement to have an emergency action plan, you should still be prepared in emergencies. Just because you're not required by 1910-157 or 1910-160 to have an emergency action plan doesn't mean that you should not be prepared for adverse weather or other reasonably anticipated emergencies. However, if you are unsure about whether you're required to have an emergency action plan or not, you can use OSHA's expert system to help you determine whether you are required to have an emergency action plan. The link for this system is at the bottom of the slide in the QR code. It will also be available again at the end of this webinar. Most emergency action plans have to be documented, though there is an exception for employers who have less than 10 employees. If an employer has less than 10 employees, then the emergency action plan does not have to be in writing as long as it is verbally communicated with all employees. Even though a facility with less than 10 employees may not be required to have their emergency action plan in writing, it's always a good idea to maintain good documentation of all programs and policies that your facility might have in place. You should also maintain a record of who the emergency action plan has been reviewed with and when, though it is not a requirement per OSHA. Depending on the circumstances and the type of emergency, the first important decision is whether to stay put or get away. Facilities should understand and plan for both possibilities. In an emergency, local authorities may or may not immediately be able to provide information on what is happening and what you should do. Use available information to assess the situation. If you see a large amount of debris in the air, or if local authorities say the air is badly contaminated, you may want to shelter in place. You should watch the television, listen to the radio, or check the internet often for information or official instructions as it becomes available. If you're specifically told to evacuate or seek medical treatment, do so immediately. If a shelter-in-place option is included in the emergency action plan, the following should be considered. Implement a means of alerting your employees to shelter in place that is easily distinguishable from the signal used for an evacuation. Train employees on the shelter-in-place procedures and their roles in implementing them. Chemical, biological, or radiological contaminants may be released into the environment in such quantity and/or proximity to a place of business that it is safer to remain indoors rather than to evacuate employees. Such releases may either be accidental or intentional. Examples of situations that might result in a decision by an employer to institute a shelter in place include an explosion in an ammonia refrigeration facility across the street, or a derailed and leaking tank car of chlorine on the rail line behind your place of business. This could be an accidental leak or exposure from a military storage facility, such as the Bluegrass Army Depot in Richmond. Another situation in that a facility would need to shelter in place would be in severe weather, such as an earthquake, a tornado, or a severe thunderstorm. In these cases, employees should know where to go, or at least be able to determine an area that would meet the definition of a shelter in place. Shelter in place means selecting an interior room or rooms within your facility or ones with no or few windows and taking refuge there. In many cases, local authorities will issue advice to shelter in place via TV or radio. The most common area that is identified as a shelter in place in facilities are restrooms, as typically these are interior rooms with no windows. If the facility has a basement, that would be the ideal shelter in place, or a room that is enclosed in concrete or cinder blocks. Putting together a comprehensive emergency action plan that deals with those issues specific to your worksite is not difficult. It involves taking what is learned from conducting a workplace evaluation and describing how employees will respond to different types of emergencies, taking into account your specific worksite layout, structural features, and emergency systems. Most organizations find it beneficial to include a diverse group of representatives, such as management and employees, in this planning process, and to meet frequently to review progress and allocate development tasks. The commitment and support of all employees is critical to the plan's success in the event of an emergency. Ask for their help in establishing and implementing your emergency action plan. At a minimum, the plan must include, but is not limited to, the following elements: means of reporting fires and other emergencies, evacuation procedures and emergency escape route assignments, procedures for employees who remain to operate critical plant operations before they evacuate, accounting for all employees after emergency evacuation has been completed, rescue and medical duties for employees performing them, names or job titles of persons who can be contacted. Although they are not specifically required by OSHA, you may find it helpful to include the following in your plan: a description of the alarm system to be used to notify employees, including disabled employees, to evacuate and/or take other actions. The alarms used for different actions should be distinctive and might include horn blasts, sirens, or even public address systems. An employee alarm system is required, though a description is not. The site of an alternative communication center to be used in the event of a fire or explosion. A secure on or off-site location to store originals or duplicate copies of accounting records, legal documents, your employees' emergency contact lists, and other essential records are recommended. Evacuation policies, procedures, and escape route assignments are required to be in an emergency action plan. They are put into place so the employees understand who is authorized to order an evacuation, under what conditions an evacuation would be necessary, how to evacuate, and what routes to take. Exit diagrams are typically used to identify the escape routes to be followed by employees from each specific facility location. It is important to note that when developing evacuation routes, that the map should notate all potential routes instead of telling a certain area to evacuate through a certain route. This is because it is impossible to predict where the fire or other event may occur. Employees should be instructed to exit through the closest and safest exit. Evacuation procedures also often describe actions employees should take before and while evacuating, such as shutting windows, turning off equipment, and closing doors behind them. Sometimes a critical decision may need to be made when planning, whether or not employees should fight a small fire with a portable fire extinguisher or to simply evacuate. Portable fire extinguishers may be integrated into the emergency action plan. However, keep in mind that if you're going to require employees to fight a fire, even in the incipient stage, that the employees will then be required to have training on fire extinguishers. This means more than just explaining the past method and includes hands-on training with fire extinguishers. A disorganized evacuation can result in confusion, injury, and property damage. When developing your emergency action plan, it's important to determine the following: conditions under which an evacuation would be necessary, conditions under which it may be better to shelter in place, a clear chain of command and designation of the person in your business who is authorized to order an evacuation or shutdown, specific evacuation procedures including routes and exits, specific evacuation procedures for high-rise buildings. Procedures for assisting visitors and employees to evacuate, particularly those with disabilities or who do not speak English. Designation of what, if any, employees will remain after the evacuation alarm to shut down critical operations or perform other duties before evacuating. A means of accounting for employees after an evacuation, special equipment for employees. If respirators would be needed, then what kind of respirators are appropriate? These are all items that should be considered when developing and implementing an emergency action plan. A wide variety of emergencies, both man-made and natural, may require a workplace to be evacuated. These emergencies include fires, explosions, floods, toxic material releases, radiological and biological accidents, civil disturbances, and workplace violence. During development and implementation of your draft plan, think about all possible emergency situations and evaluate your workplace to see if it complies with OSHA's emergency standards. Most often, the main emergencies for a facility would be a fire, tornado, or other adverse weather. However, all reasonably anticipated emergencies should be addressed in your emergency action plan. For instance, if a railway runs through or directly behind your facility, then your emergency action plan should address how your facility would react to a train derailment. Or if your facility routinely deals with troubled youth, inmates, or otherwise considered dangerous people, then an active shooter plan or a plan for workplace violence may need to be addressed in your plan. Employers will want their employees to respond differently to these different threats. For example, employers may want to have employees assemble in one area inside the workplace if threatened by a tornado, or perhaps a chemical spill on an adjacent highway, but evacuate to an exterior location during a fire. Your plan must identify when and how employees are to respond to different types of emergencies. Ask yourself questions and brainstorm worst case scenarios. What would happen if the storeroom caught on fire, the river flooded, or a train derailed, or a chemical release occurred in the shop? The type of building you work in may be a factor in your decision. Most buildings are vulnerable to the effects of disasters such as tornadoes, earthquakes, floods, or explosions. The extent of damage depends on the type of emergency and the building's construction. Modern factories and office buildings, for example, are framed in steel and are structurally more sound than neighborhood business premises may be. In a disaster such as a major earthquake or explosion, however, nearly every type of structure will be affected. Some buildings will collapse, and others will be left with weakened floors and walls. Exit routes have to be determined in your emergency action plan. This can be done in either a summary form or in the form of an evacuation map. When preparing drawings that show evacuation routes and exits, post them prominently for all employees to see. Some things to consider when determining evacuation route maps are primary and secondary exits. Your evacuation floor plan should designate at least one primary exit and one secondary exit. These exits must be remote from each other and so arranged as to minimize any possibility that they both may be blocked by any one fire or another emergency condition. No emergency exits in restrooms. Even if there is a door in a restroom that employees could exit out of, no emergency exits are designated through restrooms for evacuation of a building. Windows are never designated as exits. Roll-up or garage doors are not to be designated exits. Consequently, the floor plan does not indicate the restroom as an exit. Exit away from rooms with hazardous materials. Emergency exit routes lead away from the areas containing potentially hazardous materials so that no employee will be forced to pass through the area during an emergency, such as a tank farm. No emergency exits into narrow passages. A short passageway between two buildings may not provide enough open space for safe evacuation during an emergency. Accordingly, no emergency exit leads to this narrow space. Exit signs indicating the nearest emergency exit. Signs reading exit with an arrow indicating the directions must be placed in every location where the direction of travel to reach the nearest exit is not immediately apparent. Designate an assembly area. An assembly location should be designated outside the building for employees to gather during an emergency. The location of this assembly area should be clearly illustrated if shown on the map. No use of elevators to reach an emergency exit. The floor plan of a multiple-story building should show the locations of stairways and elevators and must indicate that the stairs, not the elevators, are the appropriate means of exit in case of an emergency. Indicate exits with wheelchair access. Where applicable, exits with wheelchair access should be designated on the floor plan. Indicate the employee's current location. The floor plan should indicate the employee's current location in the building. Most employers create maps from floor diagrams with arrows that designate the exit routes. These maps should include locations of exits, assembly points, and equipment such as fire extinguishers, first aid kits, and spill kits that may be needed in an emergency. Exit routes should be clearly marked and well lit, wide enough to accommodate the number of evacuating personnel, unobstructed and clear of debris at all times, unlikely to expose evacuating personnel to additional hazards. For example, a designated exit route should not require employees to have to go by or through a tank farm or fuel storage, as this could expose employees to an additional hazard. Pictured is a floor plan that shows the possible evacuation routes in the building. It is color-coded and uses arrows to indicate the designated exit. A room containing hazardous materials is indicated in the lower right-hand corner of the building by the flame symbol. The assembly area is indicated outside the primary exit at the top of the building. The evacuation floor plan has 3 exits. The primary exit is designated in the upper left by red arrows, with 2 main flows coming toward it indicated by bent arrows, the red rooms and the red elevator. Persons in the upper left half of the building would be directed towards this exit. The secondary exit is located centrally on the adjacent outer wall on the right side of the building. Persons in the top hallway and the second hallway would be directed with tan arrows from the tan-colored rooms toward this exit. A male and female figure representing restrooms are indicated in the first tan-colored rooms in the upper hallway. The individuals in this area should exit along the hallway toward the secondary exit at the right side of the building. Both the primary and secondary exits are marked with handicap signs. There's a third exit in the last hallway, centrally located in the outer wall opposite of the outer wall with the primary exit and adjacent to the outer wall with the secondary exit. Persons in the third hallway would be directed by blue arrows from the blue-colored rooms and the blue elevator to exit out this doorway. This exit is not designated for handicapped persons as stairs are indicated. The colored boxes indicate a row of rooms along the outer walls, with hallways parallel to the rows of outer rooms on 3 sides of the building. The outer wall on the left side of the building has a hallway along the outer wall. 4 sets of 6 colored rooms are along the internal corridors, and there are 3 large rooms centrally located with internal hallways connecting the top and the bottom of the building. The primary exit is marked with an arrow from the text below the map, as is the secondary exit. An X inscribed in a circle marks the position of the employee, indicated in the legend. In text, "You are here." On the floor plan, the employee is located in the upper left-hand corner in the internal set of 6 red-colored rooms in the central room in the second hallway. The employee may exit the red-colored room either to the left or the right, indicated by the red arrows, and then proceed toward the outer wall in the upper left primary exit. To ensure the fastest, most accurate accountability of employees, the following steps should be considered in an emergency action plan. Assembly areas can go by different names, such as a rally point, a muster point, or a refuge area. Regardless of what your facility calls it, there should be a designated assembly area. Designate assembly areas both inside and outside the workplace where employees should gather after evacuating. Assembly locations within the building are often referred to as areas of refuge. Make sure your assembly area has sufficient space to accommodate all of your employees. Exterior assembly areas used when the building must be partially or completely evacuated are typically located in parking lots or other open areas away from busy streets. Try and designate assembly areas so that the area will be upwind from the building from the most common or prevailing wind direction. Take a head count after the evacuation. Identify the names and last known locations of anyone not accounted for and pass them to the official in charge. Accounting for all employees following an evacuation is critical. Confusion in the assembly areas can lead to delays in rescuing anyone trapped in the building or unnecessary and dangerous search and rescue operations. When designating an assembly area, consider and try to minimize the possibility of employees interfering with rescue operations. Establish a method for accounting for non-employees such as suppliers and customers. Establish procedures for further evacuation in case the incident expands. This may consist of sending employees home by normal means or providing them with transportation to an off-site location. Keep in mind that being able to account for employees after an emergency evacuation is a minimum requirement. Procedures to account for employees after the evacuation to ensure that everyone got out may include designating employees to sweep areas, checking offices and restrooms before being the last to leave a workplace, or conducting a roll call in the assembly area. Many employers designate individuals to help move employees from dangerous areas to safe areas in an emergency. Generally, one designated person for every 20 employees should be adequate, and the appropriate number of designated persons should be available at all times during work hours. A designated person may be responsible for checking offices, restrooms, and other spaces before being the last person to exit an area. They might also be tasked with ensuring that fire doors are closed when exiting. All employees designated to assist in emergency evacuation procedures should be trained in the complete workplace layout and various alternative escape routes if the primary evacuation route becomes blocked. Employees designated to assist in emergencies should be aware of employees with special needs, how to use the buddy system, and any hazardous areas to avoid during an emergency evacuation. Visitors should also be accounted for following an evacuation and may need additional assistance when exiting. Some employers have all visitors and contractors sign in when entering the workplace and use this list when accounting for persons in the assembly area. The hosts and/or designated persons, if established, are often tasked with helping these individuals safely to evacuate. You may also find it beneficial to coordinate the action plan with other employers when several employers share the work site, although OSHA standards do not specifically require this. Unless the facility is a large employer handling hazardous materials and processes or have employees regular working in hazardous situations, facilities will most likely choose to rely on public resources to provide these specialized services. If a facility chooses to use external departments or agencies, such as the local fire and police departments, medical clinics or hospitals, and ambulance services, then the facility should ensure the external departments are prepared to respond as outlined in the plan. For example, the facility should have members of the local fire department conduct a walkthrough of the workplace so that they're familiar with the layout and any potential hazards. Establish a relationship with the local ambulance service so that transportation is readily available for emergencies, and make arrangements with nearby medical clinics or other facilities to handle emergency cases and to provide medical and first aid services to employees. Facilities can also incorporate the requirements for a fire prevention plan into the emergency action plan if the facility meets the requirements to need a fire prevention plan. Keep in mind that having a plan for rescue and emergency medical treatment is a minimum requirement of 1910-38. Employees must know how to report emergencies. Some facilities use internal telephone numbers, intercom, or public address systems to notify other employees. It is important for employees to also notify the proper authorities, such as fire, medical, or rescue services, if your facility relies on this type of assistance during an emergency. Once an emergency that requires a response from employees is reported, a system, typically an alarm system, must be in place to notify employees. Alarms must be distinctive and recognized by all employees as a signal to evacuate the work area or perform other actions identified in your emergency action plan. The alarm must be capable of being perceived above ambient noise and light levels. Sequences of horn blows or different types of alarms, such as bells or horns, can be used to signal different responses or actions from employees. Ideally, alarms will be able to be heard, seen, and otherwise perceived by everyone in the workplace, including those who may be blind or deaf. Otherwise, floor wardens or others should be tasked with ensuring all employees are notified. Facilities should consider providing an auxiliary power supply to the alarm system in the event of an electrical failure. Consider making available an emergency communication system, such as a public address system, for broadcasting emergency information to employees. Procedures for reporting a fire or other emergency must be included in the emergency action plan. This is one of the minimum requirements. There are preferred procedures for reporting emergencies, such as dialing 911 or an internal emergency number, or pulling a manual fire alarm, but there are many other possibilities that can be tailored to a facility. The emergency action plan should be reviewed for accuracy at least annually, or when there are staff changes that include personnel that have designated responsibilities in the emergency action plan. If there are any changes that are made to the emergency action plan, then those changes must be communicated to all employees. Another thing that I always recommend to employers is to always document, either in the header or in the footer of the document, the revision date, including the month and the year, as a reminder of when it'll be due for an annual review, but also so that the reviewer can look back at any significant policy, company, or personnel change that may have occurred since the last review and anticipate what revisions will need to be made to the emergency action plan. The emergency action plan and its elements should be communicated with all employees upon assignment. New hire orientation is a good time to cover emergency action plans with employees. Regardless of whether or not changes have been made to the plan, it's not a bad idea to do a refresher training once or twice a year with employees so that they can remain cognizant. This refresher training could be something as simple as a toolbox talk or a safety brief that highlights the main points of the emergency action plan. Evacuation drills should be conducted at least annually, though it's not a requirement. This is especially a good idea if the facility has undergone renovations or significant process changes. Evacuation drills can help identify any deficiencies in an emergency action plan that would have otherwise gone unnoticed. In this webinar, we've discussed emergency action plans, when they're required and who is required to have them, as well as tips and things to keep in mind when establishing an emergency action plan. If you do not have an emergency action plan in place or would like to start a new emergency action plan from scratch, OSHA's Expert System link is a great tool. The link at the bottom of the slide in the QR code will take you to an emergency action plan e-tool on OSHA's website where you can answer questions about your facility if you're still unsure if your facility is required to have an emergency action plan. The e-tool will then walk you through creating one. It allows you to fill out the required information about your facility and then generate a simple emergency action plan for you. The QR code for OSHA's e-tool will bring you to this page. The mobile version of this web page may look a little bit different. On this page, we have questions to determine if you need an emergency action plan. Are fire extinguishers provided in the workplace? Yes. Are the fire extinguishers intended for employee use? No. The following questions will help determine if you're required to have an emergency action plan. For all intents and purposes, our facility does not use a total flooding extinguishing system. Our facility does use a fire detection system. As you can see here, we are required to have an emergency action plan. We're going to click here and we're going to start our emergency action plan. So I've already filled out the information that is requested in the e-tool. The first section is company information. The second section is information about the alarm system and the alerts. The third section is about policies. So if you have a policy to have all employees evacuate immediately, you can check that box. Or if you have a different policy and you want to identify it, you can identify that here. The bigger your facility, the more detailed these items need to be. These boxes should contain as much information as possible. Emergency action plans are required to have evacuation routes. This can be in the form of an evacuation route map, or it can be in paragraph form. However, usually it's easier for people to understand if they can see a map in front of them. Also, if you have maps, you should post them in conspicuous areas like break areas or community areas. This section is for fire extinguishers. This is where you identify if you want to have employees fight fires with fire extinguishers or if you want them to just go to the safest, closest exit. Keep in mind that if you require people to use fire extinguishers, that they have to have fire extinguisher training that is more than just explaining the pass method. Step 6 is operations. So in the event of an emergency, the following employees are required to remain in place or to be the last people out so that they can shut down or monitor critical operations. This is not a requirement. You do not have to have somebody that stays back. It's optional. Step 7 is duties. So if you have employees that you want to perform medical or rescue duties during an emergency evacuation, you can check that here. If you don't want to, you don't have to. But if you click yes, it gives you the option to provide information about the person or persons, their job title, their name, or a phone number. Section 8 is for assembly. This is where you would do rally points if you are evacuating the building. So in this section, I identified a primary rally point and a secondary rally point in case the first one is unavailable. These should be identified on your evacuation map so that people can visually see where they are. You notice I say northeast corner of the employee parking lot. Some employees may not know where northeast is, so it's also important to identify these by a marker or a sign at the actual rally point, where the rally point is outside. Step 9 is for accounting for employees. This is where you would do a head count after everyone has been evacuated. I would recommend having a primary person and a secondary person for this in the event of maybe the primary person is on vacation or maybe they're not there. It's always a good idea to have a backup person for all of your responsibilities. Step 10 is where you can put extra information for this plan. You can add a section for attachments. You can say see attachment B. So in this situation, attachment B would be an evacuation map, and then I would attach this to the back of my plan. So once we have all of the information filled out, we're going to hit report. It will pull up a page that looks like this. All of the information that you just put into the fillable format on the website is in this report. The format is basic, very simple, nothing fancy. You can use it as a guide for your facility to develop a more detailed and better looking emergency action plan. This is just the information that you are required to have. Now that we've seen the e-tool and we've seen the information that is required to be in an emergency action plan, it makes it easier to develop and implement an emergency action plan. For more online learning opportunities, you can visit our website at kysafe.ky.gov.